then I would hand over to Nadia Humphreys, and she will be starting our taxonomy deep dive. Over to you, Nadia.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you very much for having me here today. I hope you can see my slides all right.
Yes, very good.
Brilliant. So my name is Nadia Humphreys. I work at Bloomberg in our sustainable finance team, and this is actually my very first digital conference. So I'm very excited to be part of this, and thank you. It just so happens that my local council have decided this afternoon was the perfect time to dig up the road outside my house. So I will apologise in advance for any background noise that you may hear, and Christian or Andreas, do feel free to interrupt me if I'm not clear enough at any point. So today I'm here really to address some frequently asked questions as a member of the TEG and also in my role at Bloomberg around how to apply the taxonomy to an investment portfolio. And my objective here today is to run through three main things with you. So first would be, how will the taxonomy be used? The second would be how you can apply it to a portfolio product. And the third really is, where can I find data to support any efforts that I make here? And I'll walk you through a worked example. As a bit of housekeeping, if you do have any questions, I think they are taken in this chat feed here, but also in the LinkedIn group. And maybe for the sake of time, José Luis Blasco and myself can both take questions related to the taxonomy after both of us have spoken, if that works for people. So, what is the EU taxonomy? Well, it's a science-based set of criteria that underpins a common language for fund managers who are looking to explain the sustainable nature of their investment product. And it lays out, as you see here, 6 environmental objectives. Now, if you want to claim alignment with the EU taxonomy, then the activities conducted by a business you invest in or a business you operate would need to demonstrate that they substantially contribute to one of these environmental objectives and do no significant harm to any other. So in short, what this means is that sustainability claims that you make about your investment product would need to contain a narrative in line with this EU taxonomy. So I'll come on a little bit later as to how to do that. But let's start thinking about who has to do what and by when. So there are 3 primary users you see in this slide that would start to consider the EU taxonomy in response to the EU's regulatory objectives, as Mario highlighted a little earlier. And to achieve the EU's targets, policymakers estimate there's an estimated investment gap of about 180 billion euros a year. And whilst the EU is providing support, the scale of the challenge is really beyond the capacity of the public sector. So it's important that we look to private capital to help manage that transition to net zero. So when we look at the regulatory landscape here, the Sustainable Finance Action Plan that was adopted in May 2018 has taken the shape of 3 primary pieces of legislation, and the language I'm going to use here is the taxonomy regulation, the disclosure regulation, and green labelling. So where you see the member states, it's also seeking to establish an eco-label for retail products, and I think initially this was limited to PRIPS, but later has been widened to include fixed term and saving deposits too, although I believe on that one, final criteria is expected to emerge at the beginning of next year. So let me dive into a little bit more detail. What do financial market participants need to do? So the language here is that a financial market participant would need to report the extent to which their financial product aligns with the EU taxonomy. So let's try and dissect that statement to make it mean something here. So what are financial market participants as it pertains to these regulations? Well, in-scope entities would include asset managers, and that includes venture capital and social entrepreneurship activities, as well as insurance undertaking and occupational and other pensions providers. And then when we think about what are the qualifying financial products, a misconception when I speak to people here is that it only really impacts products that are currently marketed as environmentally sustainable. But in actual fact, a lot of the regulation will include everything offered by these entities, and that includes both insurance and investment advice. So I'll go on a little more in terms of the detail of what's expected. So if we start to look at what I've called the disclosure regulation, Financial market participants are expected to report a couple of things. The first would be how they integrate into their investment decisions any negative impacts of sustainability risks. The second would be how the company considers adverse impacts on sustainability factors. And then if they are pursuing a green investment strategy, they'd need to explain how the sustainability characteristics and objectives are met. There's another piece in here around remuneration. So financial market participants and financial advisors are expected to include in their remuneration policies information about how those policies are consistent with the integration of these sustainability risks that we talked about before. And jumping on a step further into the taxonomy regulation, really this is the one we're going to dive a little deeper across the presentation into. So I'd break this requirement into really two main items. And the first is to explain how your financial product aligns with the taxonomy. And the second is to explain to what extent. So if we start with the how would be in the shape of a narrative that would complement the percentage-based disclosure. And it should clarify which environmental objective the investment is following. And that may be more than one objective for certain investment types. And then if you think about under the to what extent requirement, so here you'd be expected to disclose a proportion of the underlying investment that's taxonomy aligned, and often where we see this expressed as a percentage. There's also an expectation that people will start breaking out enabling and transitioning activities. Now, for those products, we mentioned before that it includes everything, but those products who don't pursue environmental objectives specifically here, it's okay to issue a disclaimer. And there is actually some recommended language in the updated regulation regarding what that disclaimer could look like. Another important point not to lose sight of, and I haven't mentioned it here in this slide though, is updates to the suitability requirements. And this will see explicit questions on sustainability integrated into the financial advice you give. So if a client requests environmental objectives, then these really do need to be demonstrated with the how and to what extent reporting that I've just walked through. If you're interested in a little bit more detail here, ESMA have currently opened up their consultation, and that'll run till the 1st of September, so I'd recommend you take a look. The second part of the disclosure is also that financial and non-financial companies under the scope of the NFRD would need to disclose in their non-financial statements any turnover or capital or operational expenditure that's associated with the taxonomy. And I think we'll come on to that in the second presentation. There's also an update to NFRD itself, and there is a consultation open now until the 11th of June on that item as well. Okay, so let's jump on to how do I start? So where do I start when I think about a taxonomy assessment? There is a lot of detailed technical content in the taxonomy report, and if you look at the annex as well, it's over 600 pages. So understanding how to apply the taxonomy to an investment strategy can feel really daunting when you first come to it. The first thing that I would do before we even start to look at this slide is that all companies that are subject to the disclosure of turnover, capex or opex will already include a description of how and to what extent their activities are associated with the taxonomy. So an investor in European listed firms should really be able to rely upon that information as the basis for their own reporting. What I'm going to walk through here, though, is for unclassified activities, and that would include international investment. So we heard earlier from Mario looking at broadening the taxonomy's reach to international investment, and particularly when you look at European fund structures, they include a lot of international stock in them. And it would be great if companies could start to do taxonomy assessments more broadly across their portfolio, rather than just looking at the European part of the stock they hold. So a key part of taxonomy assessment would be including defining what part of a company's activity can be assessed as sustainable. And to do this, the TEG actually have recommended a 5-step process that you can see in the report, and I've tried to visualize that here in this table. So the best starting point would be to segment the turnover or revenue of a company by its activities. And then there's a set of threshold-based tests to determine substantial contribution, and also some additional qualitative assessments required to determine do no significant harm. One of the things that I often hear questions on is that it can be difficult to verify compliance on the qualitative criteria, and a lot of them point to EU legislation, which could be difficult when you're trying to apply it internationally. So the TEG recommends that investors disclose the percentage of the fund that is potentially aligned. And if you choose to take a potential alignment figure, to demonstrate this, you should really explain which technical screening criteria couldn't be verified and why, the nature of due diligence that they have conducted, if they've engaged with the company directly, what the results were, and if they've used any estimates or proxies in their data, how they have been calculated or arrived at. It's also worth pointing out here that portfolio level due diligence on the do no significant harm criteria is expected to be risk-based. But I think we're yet to hear more from that in terms of the technical detail of the regulation too. So, the EU taxonomy will form part of a manager's narrative around an investment strategy. That we know for now. But this is saying, how do I therefore look to practically apply it to companies that I invest in? And I've got a mock-up in this slide. So the very first step that I would recommend you do is determining which percentage of an investment portfolio is eligible for taxonomy testing. And you can do that by looking at segmented revenue. So in this example, sectors 2, 3, 4 would be eligible, and that would mean that 75% of that company's revenue can pass on through to screening. Now, for those eligible activities, you need to now determine what percentage of them are meeting the detailed testing criteria. And then this score we call taxonomy alignment. So in this example, sectors 2 and 4 have met substantial contribution criteria, and the company as a whole complies with do no significant harm and minimum social safeguard requirements, which in this example means that 55% of the company's revenue could be classed as taxonomy aligned. So if we understand that model and we want to apply it at a portfolio level, it's a very, very similar approach. So to calculate the proportion of an investment, you should be able to multiply the aligned company revenue with the portfolio weighting to get your total score. And so in my example here, you'd see 67.5% of the portfolio is eligible, but 55%, a smaller number, is aligned. There's no reason you can't disclose both numbers if you would like to, particularly if you're an impact investor, let's say, and through corporate access, proxy voting, you feel like you can influence a company's behavior to make their operations more environmentally sustainable. This means that you don't have to divest and substitute higher scoring securities if you still believe in the return of your existing investment, but want to carry your investor on the journey of getting that taxonomy alignment score up over time. So as you see here, qualifying green debt should be factored into your calculation by looking at the use of proceeds. So if an asset directly claims taxonomy alignment, then the prospectus should detail that each do no significant harm test is met. And for green debt in particular, this self-certification should be verified by an independent party before the asset can meet the green bond standards, which are new rules that have come out alongside the taxonomy. So let's actually look at a practical example. It's all well and good seeing my graph. I've borrowed from Volkswagen here. And if I start to look at their annual accounts, you can see that they already segment their revenue. So here for Volkswagen, you can see 74% of their revenue is from the production of passenger cars, and nearly 15% of their revenue is actually from financing the vehicles that they've sold that are on the road. The remaining is related to the sale of commercial vehicles and some of the engineering processes. The next step is then saying, right, given that they have segmented, which of those that are eligible need to meet certain tests? So for both tests under transport and manufacturing of low carbon technology, according to the taxonomy, the tailpipe emission of the vehicles needs to be less than 50 grams of carbon dioxide per passenger kilometre up to 2025, and then 0 grams thereafter. So in the current world, the only eligible vehicle at the moment is electric. So the eligibility model will tell you that all of the revenue in these buckets from Volkswagen could qualify. So ultimately 100% of what they do could qualify. So this means that if Volkswagen's fleet was all electric, then the revenue from manufacturing and financing these vehicles would make them fully aligned to the taxonomy. So let's see how they do. Now, for Volkswagen, they do report their revenue segmented by brand. And through this, you can see that only a percentage of their fleet is electric. So in this particular example, the Audi e-tron would fully qualify. But the Audi does also make electric versions of other vehicles. So for example, the Q8 is customer elective. But as you see here, they only report the revenue for the Q8 model and don't yet break it out by electric and non-electric vehicles. So this is why more detailed reporting from corporates is required, so that we as investors can obtain more accurate taxonomy alignment figures. At the moment, you would have to be conservative and only look at those vehicles that are wholly electric. The next step, so step 3, is a detailed assessment of the Dino significant harm criteria. And this requires you to look at the other environmental objectives such as water use, waste management practices, and other polluters in their manufacturing process. The step 4 relates to minimum social safeguards. So the European Parliament and the Council state that to be eligible to the taxonomy, an activity should be carried out in alignment with the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. So this would also include the principles and rights set out in the 8 fundamental conventions identified in the Declaration of the International Labour Organization on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work and the International Bill of Human Rights. A lot of content there. So these guidelines really, if we think about them, reflect the expectation from governments to businesses on how to act responsibly. And these guidelines really bring together all thematic areas of business responsibility. So it would include human rights, labour rights, as well as the information related to bribery, consumer interest, competition and taxation. As you can see here in Volkswagen's example in their reporting, they spell out everything that they're compliant with. So it makes it much easier for you as an investor to verify that they're meeting those minimum social safeguards. Now, the final step, the step 5, is that you should therefore be able to work out the alignment score based on this information. One thing I just wanted to highlight here, and this isn't an example from Volkswagen, it's taken from another company, but one thing to be mindful of is that companies do already report their green revenue share. In some cases, their criteria do differ from those that have been suggested by the technical annex of the taxonomy. So I would recommend you look into it in a little bit more detail. So in this example, I've gone through and you can see that a number of criteria are the same as I've checkmarked across the statement that this company has made. So I would say that it is worth verifying yourself. So what does this all build up to? Really, and this would be kind of my final slide, is this is what you're aiming at as an investor to tell your story. So the taxonomy is a common narrative around an investment product, something that over time we hope will allow investors to compare between products and ultimately finance the transition to net zero. So an investment manager will be expecting to break out what portion of a portfolio is aligned or potentially aligned. And as we grow out the reporting capabilities in companies, that alignment figure should be known and should be larger. And that will look to all 6 environmental objectives. So thus satisfying the investor demand that we know is already out there for environmentally sustainable products, and ultimately helping guide private capital to support our net zero ambition. So with that, I think I will hand over to José Luis Blasco to talk a little bit more about what this feels like from a company's perspective.
Thank you very much, Nadia. That's excellent. Indeed, we will now get José Luis to share his screen. I'll give you a round of applause here. Just a quick note for everybody, we'll do a Q&A jointly on taxonomy for Nadia and José Luis after José Luis' talk. You can ask questions to the organizers on the Google meeting, which we can read out. If you want an open discussion, we appreciate if you go to the LinkedIn group where 50 of you have already registered. It's also in the invite. And directly under Nadia's talk, you can ask any question and discuss it with anyone in the wider audience. José Luis, I'm handing over to you, and anyone, I'm looking forward to the LinkedIn discussion.
Oh, thank you, Andreas. Can you hear me? Could you check, please, in order to give your feedback at this moment?
We hear you extremely well. We let you know in case there's any technical difficulties, but at the moment it's perfect.
Okay. Great. Thank you for inviting me. It's also my first time in these Zero Zone webinars. The purpose of my slides is to show why Acciona was interested to develop a complete exercise applying the methodology proposed by the taxonomy, and also what was the results that we already got in our first and second exercises. First of all, I need to explain in only one slide why we are interested on this. First of all, because Acciona is not an energy company with a legacy of infrastructure. We are not an infrastructure construction typical traditional company diversified in energy or renewables. We consider ourselves unusual. We were struggling with the classification of the traditional investors because they classify us as energy renewables, or depending on the EBITDA, or if we are classified by revenues, we are a heavy construction company. But our understanding about what is happening is because we have very good signals about how megatrends are managing or driving the investment of the public sector, and we see the availability of a huge amount of capital in the market, and only a few greenfield developers who can offer solutions in order to link both the needs and also the capital availability. With this value proposition, we see the low carbon economy and the zero and the neutrality or the zero the emissions target as an opportunity. But when we see how the investors are seeing the market, we think that there are a lot of black or blind spots. First of all, because most of the current ratings are focused on risk, the current assessment for the companies are better designed to inform this risk, and these risks are also informed at the corporate level. That when we are talking about environmental and social topics, for me is a basic a problem and a challenge, and in the coming years we will have many discussions about how the current ratings are assessing the companies, with taking into account that the social and environmental things are local, and our reports are corporate, are a corporate level. Let me give you an example. And when we are in the market, this is our pathways for the neutrality. We are at this stage around 150, 60 or 70, 100 tons of CO2. This is our businesses and also our pathway. This is our goal for this year. We are in the SBT commitment for 1.5 degrees scenario reduction targets, and we were from 2016 carbon neutral. What does it mean? All the carbon emission that we have, we are a company with 40,000 employees with around 7.5 billion of revenues, are neutral, compensated every year, buying United Nations certified emission reductions. With this level of commitments, we go to the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, and we see that in the same sector we are also in the top of the of the ESG rating assessment, but we are around 60 tons CO2 per million euros of revenues, and our peers in the same group, in the same sector, has, for example, 1,200 tons of per million revenues. This is not in the same. We are evidently we are not in the same sector, guys. We are not in the same sector. We see that we have a high carbon intense economy in the same sector that are very intensive. We have a transition people or companies who are trying to improve with a lot of capex, struggling with the current circumstances in order to transform their operations into more green. And we have another sector we see that could be a new sector that is a low carbon sector. And for us, and with this picture, we see that the ESG assessment should include into their assessment how the companies are embracing the opportunities of these mega trends. And for us, was a very interesting exercise, because if you have a picture where taking into account your risk and also your opportunities, that at the end of the day, the taxonomy means, we were very comfortable in order to explain better what we are doing in our strategy. And it was our first approach, why we were in the pioneer group of companies who wants to be to apply in the taxonomy. Let me explain how it works and what was the result for the application of this exercise to Acciona's activities. As my colleague has explained very well, we have the most contributors of the CO2 emissions at the European Union, this sixth sector, and also an enabling sector that is the ICT. And we need to identify in each sector what are the activities related to this this sector, and after that we need to develop some technical criteria that are perfectly explained in the taxonomy technical report from the tech this year, before this year, and we need to take all this theory into our account flow information system. Let me explain how it works. If we have an activity, we can have the first of all the principles that you need to apply. You have in the taxonomy another thing that this is the KPI that you need to measure in order to identify what are the thresholds be above or be below. You need to you are part of this low carbon economy, and then you can discover the part that could be more tricky, that could be is called the do not significant harm. What is the rationale behind that? The first thing is that imagine that you are in a room and we are in a time machine, and we wake up in 2050 and we open the door and ask to the first person we met, okay, guys, are we net zero in Europe? Yes, of course, sir. We get zero carbon economy last year. Okay, and how is the electricity at this stage produced? With less of 100 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. And this is the answer. The answer is we are in a time machine. We see in Europe in the zero carbon economy in 2050. And if you are investing today, probably most of the assets that you are investing today will survive in 2050. And the answer to that is how we can show to the investors that we are understanding that this enormous transition, this enormous evolution, this enormous revolution for business transformation is taken into account in our strategy. How it works? I'll give you an example. This is the first question is that if we have activities eligible. Okay, we go to our asset with one recommendation for the beginners is that this works very well in assets, not so well when you go through the companies, because your family tree in your company probably will be dedicated to one or more activities. First of all, is to identify if your activities are eligible for the taxonomy, and we have our first chapter, transmission and distribution of electricity. Okay, guys from Acciona, do you have assets working on this field? Yes. We have 3 projects this year, these 3 years, 2 in Spain, Subestación de Cubillos, 1 in Mexico, Topolobampo 3, and the 3rd is in Spain, also in Zaragoza, Bob Goya. Okay, are these projects distributing energy? Yes, are 3. But if we apply the second criteria, that is the threshold, we discover the warning, the electricity mix that we need to transmit or to distribute should be below 100 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. And we have a problem. Topolobampo 3 is not aligned with that, because the electrical mix of Mexico is above of this figure. And okay. But what is the third? In this sector, in the transmission and distribution of electricity, the do no significant harm criteria is simple, because you need to comply with the legislation and also with some safeguards on environmental things. And we perfectly was aligned with this criteria. And about the minimal safeguards, we have every year due diligence process with audits for around 20% of our assets in terms of how we are complying with our commitments in terms of policies. We are talking about the UN Global Compact, we are talking about the CDE multinational principles, and also ILO conventions, also indigenous people, these kind of things that we need to review every year. Okay. If we see this example, we have 2 projects, Subestación de Cubillos and UTE Bob Goya, who are aligned with the, that's fine. We take the CAPEX, if we had CAPEX for these projects, we take it out of the list, or we take note, or we have revenues from this project, we take the revenues from that project. Let me give you another example that could be with another problematic. The second is about low carbon transport. This low carbon transport is looking for transportation, low carbon or zero carbon. And we have different projects around the world making tunnels and metro and electric railways that we are producing. In the beginning, all of them are in the threshold. Why? Because are aligned with the criteria that we have in the taxonomy. But we have another problem. That the second problem that we have is the do no significant harm established that the 80% of the waste that we are collecting from this project, 80% should be recycled. And this is not only occur in not all the jurisdictions. We have projects in Dubai, or we have projects in other places in Ecuador that was not allowed. It was not aligned with the taxonomy. And we apply our due diligence process about the minimum safeguards, and this is okay. When we collect all this information from our accountancy systems, we discover that our CAPEX is 93% aligned with the taxonomy. Our EBITDA are 83%, and our revenues are 58. Sorry, and this for us was a very interesting discovery, because at the end of the day, these kind of arguments are explaining us better than the current traditional classification that we have in the market. If we discover different activities, for Acciona is very interesting because we are very diverse in terms of what we are doing. We have activities in the energy sector, as I said. We have also in the infrastructure sector. This is very relevant for us because explain what we are doing and how we are contributing to the low carbon economy in this vision that we have in order to connect the investors interested on this, and also with the mega trends to have a specialist on to multiply the impact that we are making with our infrastructure. We made our first exercise in October 19 with the first draft, and we repeat with this draft. We consider it interesting to redefine our green financing framework, and we developed again the same exercise, and during the last fiscal year results presentation, we offer the second exercise about the taxonomy with the figures of the fiscal year 19, verified, audited by our financial auditor, and also we collect our second party opinion in order to be aligned with the green financing framework that we had. We have at this moment around $4 billion related to our first green financing framework. This low carbon taxonomy case study is available publicly and also audited by our financial auditor, following the common practices of auditing. We expect that we expand this exercise to the other 4 taxonomies that we expect could be developed the next year. We are also very enthusiastic about the International Platform on Sustainable Finance, because give us the opportunity to have another common language to talk with our investors in another part of the world. But because for me is very interesting how the other jurisdictions is taking more momentum or taking more interest every day or every week and every month about how the taxonomy in Europe is developed. And also because we think that there is a space and opportunity for the creation of a new sector. If you have a look to the last crisis, the first weeks of the crisis, every of you probably you have seen how the ESG indexes has responded more resilient. To be honest, I am not so keen with the word resilience, because resilience comes from the Latin resilio. Resilio is jump back. I don't want to return to January. To be honest, I don't want to be returned to the same place that we tried at that time to change. I think that we need to change, trying to leverage on the current situation, stand up again with a new framework, with a new paradigm, in order to transform and contribute additionally what we are doing. And we think that taking into account how the infrastructure can add value to the society, to take into account the taxonomy, give us the opportunity to explain better what we are doing, and also wants to help another companies that probably are in the same sector than ours in this new sector that is low carbon taxonomy. Thank you, Andres.
Thank you very much, José Luis. We have the first questions, I guess it's for both Nadia and you. So if Nadia could also unmute. José Luis, the question, and it's a common question, to what extent do the existing corporate sustainability reporting frameworks or the data help investors from the outside assess taxonomy compliance? So you are, of course, within Acciona, so you have a fantastic documentation, which I even teach in the CSIF degree. But if it was an outside investor looking at Acciona, how much of that could they actually see?
Now, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Now is in our sustainability report. You can any investor can take this information from the integrated reporting, our integrated report, of our sustainability report. Depending if you are interested, taking into account what are the solutions that we are offering in the market, you can consult the integrated report. we are following the principles of the integrated reporting guidelines, and with our sustainability report is more detailed, more granular about how we are managing the impacts of our activity. But you can find also this information in both reports.
And before you published your own compliance,
yeah, no,
for people or not?
No, it's difficult. For an investor, it's for me. I like a lot the effort that the investment world is making to get this information from public information that they get from the reports. But it's very difficult. To give you an example, the problem is the thresholds. The thresholds don't give you is difficult to implement if you are looking or reading a conventional sustainability report. You have seen, for example, how you can assess where the assets are for distribution and electricity in an electric common company. Not easy sometimes to talk. Maybe you can take time, but for example, the example that our colleague has developed in her slides makes a lot of sense. You say, okay, if you don't want to report on this, I will take this information, but only the information that are reliable to the goal that we are looking for. If you want to be better considered as a taxonomy aligned, you have an easy exercise. Do it. And I think that the current frameworks only allow you partially to get this information for the investors. I don't know if my colleague is agreeing with that.
Nadia?
No, I agree. I think the primary obstacle is that what you will find is most companies that are good and do report environmental characteristics do so at an entity rather than an activity level. Now, to do a taxonomy-based assessment, it requires activity, but it also requires the concept of life cycle. And so while things like substantial contribution to mitigation have their threshold-based tests, and those of them that you can demonstrate, so for example, in manufacturing, you can look at the carbon emissions related to the production of whatever the output may be, or the energy used in order to do whatever the output may be. That could be reasonably straightforward to do. And if you are already, for example, monitoring your water usage and your waste management practices, if you're already collecting that data because of a CSR, then you just need to find a different way of organizing it and calculating it in line with the taxonomy. Now, if you've never started to do this and you haven't started collecting that data, then I think it's recognized even by the Commission colleagues that that's a tall ask, and that comes with a degree of cost as well in order to do a taxonomy-aligned reporting. That's what you see come forward in things like the consultation papers that they've put out there for response related to this type of disclosure.
I'll have a follow-up question, Nadia, regarding your specific slides. So on the 5-step process, right? The first step is, has a taxonomy criteria already been made for this activity? Is the expectation that eventually every activity that is in an ACE classification will be in one of the 6 taxonomy ambitions, or is it possible that some simply will be out of scope? What's your view on that question? I mean, it's of course somewhat.
Yeah, so I think if I could just take it a step back, Andreas, if we think about the NACE classification and how people segment their revenue, those two things don't always marry particularly well, and particularly with investors, they tend to use other industry classification tools in their investment workflow than NACE. That's not most typically used. So those vendors have all, including Bloomberg, worked on creating a mapping profile. And I think, Andreas, in your handbook, you have one example of that, and also on the Commission's website, they've outlined the Refinitiv mapping. I think the GICS mapping and the BICS mapping are all available. There's always a proxy to that. If I can look at it in terms of what we do in Bloomberg, so we capture segment revenue for between 40 and 50,000 companies. And we capture that down to a 6th or 7th layer of granularity. So if you're thinking about power generation, for example, we would split power generation down to lots of smaller segments of activities, some of which, therefore, it's much easier to map to the taxonomy in terms of eligibility. But if the company is only saying this is my revenue and it's associated to power generation, and they give no more granularity than that, it becomes very difficult to map them down to things like renewable energy sources that would demonstrate that they are taxonomy aligned. So that process, I would agree with you, Andreas, is not straightforward, but I think vendors have worked hard to try and make that a little easier for their investor client community.
Absolutely. So on the handbook and on the tech website, you can find the matches between Bloomberg BICS and NACE, GICS, ICB, Thomson TRCB as well. So all these matches are there. So then specifically asking about BICS. So BICS on level 5, 6, 7 has a very, very detailed levels of activities, sometimes applicable to a few companies. It's very nicely fine-grained. Will we eventually see each of these activities covered in some taxonomy, or could there be activities that simply are where there is no thresholds for them at all?
That's a good question. I think the ambition of the platform is to start to expand out taxonomy substantial contribution tests across more industry groups. We started, and I don't know if I'm answering your question directly here, Andreas, but we started with, I think it was just shy of 93% of emissions producing sectors in terms of the primary ones that we in the TEG looked at. But we do recognise that there are other industry groups and sectors that are doing things well and that would like to have recognition through the taxonomy, and that's why the platform is designed to be able to take and review those industry sectors and see what, in effect, green looks like, or the green activities would need to look like over each environmental objective. Is that, Andreas, your question?
Yes, absolutely. So in essence, the platform will make an ambition to cover each activity that an investor can invest in, but probably has to be seen if after 6 environmental ambitions, there might be still some activities that don't have sufficient connotation, if I understand it correctly, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
José Luis, a question for you. And please, everybody, do feel free to post questions on the chat or on the LinkedIn group. And this is maybe an overall question, but I'm very stunned. We've seen Repsol's commitment, now we've seen Acciona, there is some other Spanish companies as well. What is it that Spain is so interested in net zero compared to some of the other countries? And Ifigenia's presentation, it was even shown as one of the countries that is over proportionally net zero committed.
Okay, I think that the Spanish companies have become international, not so maybe 20 years ago. My theory is always that if you see the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, we have a lot of Spanish companies there. I think that is part of the presentation of the introduction of the Spanish companies in the international markets. I think that this is a part of the the business card that some companies have used. Also because I think that there are a lot of cases in the not only in Spain. For example, if you go to Korea, you will find the same emulative exercise with a lot of Korean companies engaged on the sustainability. If you go now for Colombia, is also, if you are expanding your activities around the world, I think that sustainability credentials are a good credential to introduce yourself, and I think that it could be the reason.
Thank you very much. Nadia, also, if people want to follow up, I'm sure they can ask further questions on LinkedIn. Is that okay with you?
Yeah,
yes,
of course, no problem.
Of course. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both. We're giving a loud applause.
Thank you very much for your invitation.